Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, today we're jumping into just one source, but it's a really provocative essay. It's drawing some pretty intense historical lines.
Yeah, it really is. It takes a modern political platform in New York City, the one associated with Zohran Mamdani, and basically says, hold on, this looks a lot like the lead up to the Russian Revolution back in 1917.
And the author, Dr. Lev Neymotin, has a unique viewpoint here, doesn't he? Because he actually came from the Soviet Union.
Exactly. So for him, it's not just an academic comparison. He looks at this NYC movement and has this, well, almost gut reaction. He literally says, I have seen this movie before.
Yeah.
It's that feeling of tragic deja vu.
And that's really the core of what we want to unpack today. This argument that New York City, of all places, might be replaying this historical script, a script where, appealing ideas like justice and equality are maybe masking something else.
Something the author sees as the old, failed promise of something for nothing. The idea that this is somehow a morally better way to run things.
Right. So to really get into that, we need to understand the author's take on the original story first. What was happening in Russia before the revolution?
Well, the author paints a pretty bleak picture of pre-revolutionary Russia. We're talking early 1900s. Think massive contrasts.
Okay.
You had huge numbers of peasants who couldn't read, city workers in just awful factory conditions, miserable poverty, and then this tiny elite controlling basically everything: land, industry.
So real systemic hardship, not exactly subtle.
No, not at all. The working people were genuinely oppressed, poor, uneducated. They were suffering, plain and simple. That's the audience Lenin and the others were initially talking to.
Which makes those early promises, bread, peace, and land, incredibly powerful, right? They're not abstract political goals.
Absolutely not. They were about survival.
Uh.
The author stresses that the appeal was aimed squarely at people who felt they had nothing left to lose, who'd known generations of misery under the Tsar.
But the essay pivots pretty quickly from that promise to what actually happened next, when those promises, well, didn't materialize.
Yeah, Dr. Neymotin is very clear on this. He argues the promises were impossible from the start, that they just didn't align with basic economics or, frankly, human nature. So when things inevitably fell apart,
What replaced the promises?
fear, prison, and silence. That's the author's summary. Land became forced collective farms. Bread became starvation. Peace. Well, that vanished pretty fast. It turned totalitarian.
And the author doesn't see this as some kind of mistake or a deviation from the plan?
No, he sees it as the inevitable result, an ideological necessity, really. Millions died, generations were crushed in what he calls this suffocating laboratory of slogans and suspicion. It wasn't just politics gone wrong, it was a full-blown societal disaster.
Okay, that's a heavy backdrop. So now, let's leap forward. A whole century later, we're not in Petrograd anymore. We're in bustling, modern New York City. And the author sees a key difference in who this new revolutionary class is.
Yes, and this is where it gets, well, jarring for him. The essay is really strong on this point. The people attracted to this modern platform, they aren't facing that kind of systemic material oppression. They're not starving. They're not slaves in factories. They have access to education.
In fact, he calls them, I think the quote is, the most materially secure and socially protected population in history.
That's the phrase, yeah. And this is the absolute core of the paradox he's pointing out. If the old revolution fed on real physical desperation, how do you start a similar movement among people who are objectively pretty comfortable?
And this is where he brings in that idea of manufactured victimhood. Is that the term?
That's it. He calls it the genius of neo-communism today. Since it can't rely on empty stomachs, it has to, in his words, manufacture victimhood to justify power.
How does that work, according to him?
It means creating a narrative. Convincing people who are, relatively privileged that they are still oppressed, just maybe in different ways: systemic bias, historical guilt, emotional wounds, things like that. The feeling of being a victim becomes the key, the moral justification for demanding radical change.
Yeah. So you get this strange situation he describes. People who are educated, but he calls them miseducated. Privileged, but convinced they're oppressed. Free, but somehow feeling enslaved by the idea that freedom itself is unfair. It's more psychological.
Yeah, entirely psychological and ideological, according to the essay. And he makes this really sharp point about ignorance, too. Back in Soviet times, ignorance was forced on people. The state controlled information, right? Books banned, news censored.
Right. Lack of access to truth.
But today, in a place like New York, with information everywhere, the internet, libraries, universities, he argues the ignorance is different. He calls it voluntary chosen from abundance.
What does he mean by voluntary ignorance there? Like, what does that look like?
It's like choosing not to see certain things, deliberately filtering out facts or history or data that doesn't fit the narrative you prefer, the one that makes you feel morally right or confirms your sense of grievance.
So ignoring maybe economic data that contradicts the oppression narrative or dismissing the history of actual communist regimes because it's, well, inconvenient for the current slogans.
Exactly. You choose the victim script, the author argues, even when your own life might show something different, because that script gives you moral leverage and a reason to demand power or resources.
Okay, so if the modern target audience is already materially secure, what's the big draw? What's the seduction? The author says communism fails not by promising too little, but too much.
Right. And the seduction is powerful because it offers this ultimate kind of ethical release. The idea that society owes you everything while you owe society nothing.
Sounds nice on paper.
It does. The author admits it sounds compassionate, progressive, humane. Who wouldn't want a world where the collective takes care of everything and you don't have personal responsibility for, producing or earning? Yeah. Feels good.
But as history seems to show, actually running a society like that, it comes with a massive hidden cost.
A huge one. Because if you guarantee everything but demand nothing in return, well, the engine just stops. Production collapses. So to keep the illusion going, the state has to step in. Hard.
Which leads to
Coercion, confiscation, and control. The author sees those as unavoidable steps. You have to force people, take things, and manage every little detail because the basic premise just doesn't work on its own. Reality keeps pushing back against the utopia.
Okay, let's talk about another contrast he makes, which I found really striking. It's about the intellectual side of things. He actually gives some credit, in a way, to the original figures Marx, Lenin, Trotsky.
It's a nuanced point. He acknowledges that those guys, whatever you think of their outcomes, were serious intellectuals, deeply read, wrestling with big ideas about history and economics. They genuinely believed they were building heaven on earth, even if, it required purges and gulags to get there.
They had a vision, however flawed or horrific it turned out to be.
Exactly, a kind of disciplined, if destructive, intellectual framework.
So what happens, in his view, when you take that original impulse but strip away the intellectual rigor?
Well, according to the source, the modern version loses that discipline. It gets amplified by social media, quick hits, emotional reactions, and ends up being led by people he pretty bluntly calls bureaucratic mediocrities whose only skill is organizing outrage.
Wow, mediocrities.
Yeah.
That's direct. What makes him label them that way compared to the originals?
He argues they lack that big, cohesive vision. They're good at mobilizing people now for this protest or that online campaign. Their skills are in generating buzz, hashtags, public shaming, immediate emotional impact.
Less about restructuring society based on a theory, more about winning the news cycle.
Sort of, yeah. That's the implication. It's like an imitation of the past, but without the original grim intellectual weight. It becomes more about performance, maybe.
Which kind of leads us to his prediction for how this plays out in the U.S. If it is a replay, he seems pretty sure it won't end like 1917 with much blood in the streets. Why not?
He basically trusts American resilience. Dr. Neymotin thinks the U.S. is just too large, too resilient, and too constitutionally inoculated for a full-blown repeat.
Meaning our system has built-in checks.
Yeah, decentralized power, rule of law, a strong opposition. These act like antibodies, preventing a total system collapse like what happened in Russia.
But he still sees a localized danger, and this is where he uses that really interesting phrase, the vaccine called New York.
Exactly. It's a fascinating analogy. The idea is that maybe experiencing a dose of this Mamdani-ism, as he terms it, this sort of attractively packaged ideology, might actually help the country in the long run.
How so? Like a vaccine uses a weak virus.
Precisely. It lets the nation see what this ideology looks like when it's put into practice, even on a smaller scale, when it's repackaged as compassion. He thinks the visible results, maybe the policy failures or economic strain in New York,
Could serve as a warning?
yeah, it could maybe shock people, especially younger generations, into seeing that just having good intentions, that moral righteousness without personal responsibility, as he puts it, can actually lead to decay.
What kind of decay is he talking about there? What does he suggest New York is actually experiencing?
He implies both physical and moral decay. So maybe things like public services declining, crime going up, businesses leaving the tangible results of policies that might ignore basic economic incentives.
And the moral side?
That's maybe a breakdown in trust, or the idea that success should be earned being replaced by resentment, or seeing government support not as a safety net, but as a moral right owed to you regardless of contribution. That kind of shift in perspective.
Still, even though he thinks the overall system is safe, he ends with a pretty significant worry, doesn't he?
Oh, absolutely. His big fear is that the lesson stays local,
Yeah.
that people outside New York will just shrug and say, oh, well, that's just New York being New York.
And they won't recognize the same underlying ideology potentially bubbling up in their own communities.
Exactly. They'll miss the connection. They won't see the manufactured victimhood strategy, as he calls it, being used elsewhere, maybe more subtly.
So he suggests we might actually need more examples, more localized failures.
That's the unsettling conclusion, yeah. He floats the idea that America might need a series of these smaller outbreaks, these mini Mamdanis across different states, before the whole country develops, like full immunity, before everyone really gets why the promise of something for nothing always comes at a cost, no matter how nicely you dress it up.
Wow. So it's this mix of historical echo and maybe modern absurdity, which fits with his final point about history repeating itself, first tragedy then.
Then comedy, yeah. Or maybe farce is a better word. He frames this modern sequel to 1917 as having influencers instead of commissars, hashtags instead of decrees, and handouts instead of hard labor.
The tools are different, but the underlying script, he argues, is disturbingly similar. Control just shifts from, the state police to maybe social pressure and bureaucratic rules.
Right. It all comes back to that core warning from the author. Every utopia starts with a beautiful promise, but always ends with a price tag.
And that final line of the essay just hangs there. The price of something for nothing is always and forever everything.
It's a powerful takeaway, especially coming from someone with his background. It really underscores the stakes he sees in these ideological debates.
Yeah, absolutely. So drawing on Dr. Neymotin's analysis, here's something for you, the listener, to think about. That idea of manufactured victimhood. When you hear political debates, when you see calls for social reform, try to consider that line. When does a genuine push to fix real problems, real systemic issues, potentially cross over into what the author describes as a kind of performance, a way to gain moral leverage or power? Where do you draw the line between addressing injustice and maybe falling into that voluntary ignorance he talked about, ignoring uncomfortable facts because they don't fit the preferred story? It's a tough distinction, something to mull over. Thanks for diving deep with us today.